I wish to acknowledge and pay deep respect to the Gubbi Gubbi and the Nuthara people and their ancestors, who are the original inhabitants of this land. My fellow Australians, on November 11th, this Remembrance Day, 2017, let us not only remember the lives of our brave Australians lost to wars, but let us imbue meaning on that memory and rekindle a coherent sense of our national identity that our soldiers fought and died so bravely for. My name is Peter Priest. My friends call me El or Elahai. I took that name in 2003 after the death of my stillborn son. I am delivering this speech from Koroi on the Sunshine Coast of Queensland, at the War Memorial you can see behind me. I choose not to run as an independent candidate for Noosa this Queensland general election for two main reasons. Reason one, I am currently the only candidate for honorary consul between Australia and the Democratic Republic of Congo in the history of the relationship of both nations. Currently, the only diplomatic relationship maintained is through the Australian ambassador to Zimbabwe, Ms. Susan McCourt, and so is not a direct diplomatic tie. You may be aware that our lives in Australia are indelibly impacted by Congo every day due to 80% of the cobalt and coltan used to make our mobile phones operate are supplied directly from DRC mines through mostly corrupt supply chains fueled by conflict and slave labour. Reason two, the Australian Electoral Commission is an arm of the Australian government, the same government which the intelligence work I am disclosing in this speech has legally rendered the Cabinet and many of our agencies illegitimate to serve the Australian people. Without a public disclosure on the intelligence I have brought before them and a further Royal Commission into the allegations I am putting forward. This intelligence information that I am putting forward relates to a prior Australian Royal Commission that more senior people in our community will remember occurring in 1980 into the death and alleged assassination of Frank Nugan, an Australian citizen and one of the owners of the Nugan Hand Merchant Bank in Sydney. It was such a serious investigation that Frank Nugan's body was exhumed after burial for further autopsy, and the business card of former CIA Director William Colby was found in his pocket at the time of his death. Let me remind the Australian people that foreign interference by foreign intelligence agencies is illegal in Australia and is also illegal in the rest of the world. Before I continue, please allow me to acquaint you with a little bit more background on who I am before I proceed with my allegations. I am the son of a jeweller, a business that was begun in Gunnedah, New South Wales in 1946 by my grandfather, Sergeant Alexander Priest of the 2nd 18th Battalion, lest we forget. Pop was a POW in Changi for 3.5 years, and several of his items can be found in a new display at the Gunnedah War Memorial Museum. The tin cup that Pop had filled to survive in Changi over those grueling years was donated to the museum at the time of his passing. Sergeant Priest donated items, including the tin cup from his World War II service, to the museum as a meaningful sentimental gesture for posterity, and in his own words, as a reminder of the evilness of man to humanity. I was a restless teenager, just up the road, just over here, at Koroi Noosa State High School, many years ago I might add, but later went on to moving to Scotland in my 20s. Whilst in the UK, I was invited to become UK Director of the Institute for Cooperation in Space, which was founded by the protege of the father of rocketry, Dr. Werner von Braun. Her name is Dr. Carol Sue Rosen, and she was the first female corporate manager of an aerospace company, that company, Fairchild Industries. I worked through her with luminaries like Sir Arthur C. Clarke, responsible for geostationary orbits, and astronaut Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who still holds the record for the longest moonwalk, as well as former Canadian Defence Minister Paul Hellyer, the longest serving member of the Canadian Privy Council. Because of my role, I was invited by the Malaysian government to give a keynote speech at the 2008 World Peace Congress. I covered aerospace and defence topics, and you will note Blink 182 member Tom DeLonge has just recently made a public announcement about this same technology in the media, just last month in October of this year. Mr. DeLonge is backed by Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, John Podesta. DeLonge has now announced classified technology in 2017 that I had already announced almost a decade prior at the World Peace Congress. That is anti-gravity propulsion and the government's secret and covert use of this technology. All this information, including Mr. DeLonge's speech, with CIA officials also speaking, and Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works engineers on unacknowledged special access programs, otherwise known as USAPs in military acronym terminology, you will find available via reputable media sources on the internet. This is not, and I emphatically state, a tinfoil hat science. For people still defaulting to that nefarious mind control subversion by the military-industrial complex, I suggest you pull your heads firmly out of the proverbial sand. Again, I would highlight, this also relates to you, the Australian taxpayer, as the Australian military has a Signals Directorate agreement through Pine Gap with the Australian military and a US Army cooperation pact with several bases in the Northern Territory and beyond. More recently, this year I spent 4 months in the Democratic Republic of Congo, establishing a new ethical supply chain of diamonds and commodities to the world market. As I said earlier, I am the son of a jeweller. This supply chain will be secured with state-of-the-art blockchain technology backed by IBM and represent a robust humanitarian and technological platform for a largely oppressed African nation. As a result of this work, I was offered a diplomatic role between my two much-loved nations. My candidature is currently in process with Ambassador McCourt and the DRC Foreign Ministry. I will also consciously forfeit this candidature as a result of the breach of trust of our federal government, if I must. What does all this have to do with Remembrance Day, you might ask? Well, I would appreciate your patience with me as you allow me to make that connection. Whilst in the UK, I began to look at bank-to-bank transactions with MTNs, otherwise known as medium-term notes, including private placement situations at the back end of banks to generate capital to invest into the research and development of the technology that Dr. Rosen and her esteemed associates advised I focus on as part of Dr. Werner von Braun's legacy. This very same technology that Mr. DeLonge announced just last month. What I found exploring this upper theatre of banking was a web of deceit, broken promises, theft and corruption that led to the highest heights of the CIA, to the Contras in Nicaragua, and the crack cocaine epidemic that hit the streets in both Los Angeles and New York. An investigation that led me to one of the most important royal commissions in Australia's history. At the very same time as laundering operations for drugs in Nicaragua were happening, so was happening the heroin smuggling from Vietnam, where profits were being funneled and subsequently laundered through the Australian Nugan Merchant Bank in Sydney. These funds were then used for black covert operations that the CIA was able to conduct without their congressional oversight, i.e. they were finally self-funding. This was the main goal. As a result, the biggest historical establishment names in CIA history, and also American history, developed the 5-star trust. 1 star for each man. Those 5 men were, in no particular order, former CIA Director William Colby, now deceased since 1996. Richard Lansdale, CIA Associate General Counsel, now deceased 2008. Richard Armitage, former United States Deputy Secretary of State, still alive. CIA assassin Lieutenant Colonel Roberto Ferreira, now living Lorin William Rosier, last known to be near 92 years old and still living in a CIA safe house in Norway. And the 41st President of the United States, George Bush Sr., also a former CIA director. If this behaviour concluded back in 1980, at the end of the Nugan Merchant Bank Royal Commission, I may have left this subject alone. After all, it's in the past, right? Wrong. I can confirm that trades from the Five Star Trust are happening off the books in most major banking institutions around the world today. How do I know this? A senior British Lord, Lord David James of Blackheath, announced an inquiry into these practices in the House of Lords in 2011. Lord James referenced an almost unbelievable amount of money traded between the Federal Reserve Bank, JP Morgan, and the Royal Bank of Scotland, their global accounts. In 2009, this sum of money was 15 trillion US dollars. That's 15 trillion US dollars, which was the same amount of the US debt in 2011. This happened at the height of the global financial crisis. At the same time, the Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS, was given a £45 billion taxpayer bailout by the British government. You might ask how RBS needed $45 billion if it operated with such amounts as 15 trillion US dollars. Well, this is the difference between a bank's public balance books and their off-balance accounting. For these banks established under the aegis of national security for such foreign intelligence agencies as the CIA, it is an elaborate banking infrastructure that exists off the balance books in what's called grey screen and unregulated and completely untaxed black market. This type of black market trading is directly impacting the Australian economy and thus you, the taxpayer and the Australian citizen. Because of the intelligence I held in this industry, I eventually became Lord David James's chief advisor whilst I lived in the United Kingdom. It is worthy to note that David James was given his lordship of Blackheath because of his work for Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service, the SIS, more affectionately termed MI6, in Vauxhall Cross, London. His lordship was recommended by Sir John Scarlett, the former chief of MI6, for Lord James's successful work for the Secret Intelligence Service. Lord James is to date considered the most successful unofficial secret intelligence agent in British history, for operations I am not at liberty to discuss just now. I personally have had an unofficial relationship with MI6 due to this work since the May of 2009. This has enabled me a deep insight into the military banking intelligence complex and the international intelligence machine. I was an asset, you might say, that had a convenient, plausible deniability by official channels. So in 2011 was contacted by the then Office of the Director of the CIA, who at the time was Leon Panetta, over the case of the 15 trillion that President Obama was at that time attempting to use to plug the US debt ceiling. I still hold records of those meetings which have been put before the Australian government along with irrefutable proof, included vetted FBI documents, Department of Defence documents, recorded telephone conversations, eyewitness statements, not to mention Lord David James's statement as a respected member of the British establishment as backed by the Secret Intelligence Service. May I remind you again, my fellow Australians, that this obscene criminality has gone unacknowledged by Australian authorities, who continue to conduct a relationship with what can be considered, based off the evidence I have at hand, as a terrorist entity. Collaborating with terrorists in Australia is a crime punishable by strict and serious laws. Laws which are being mocked and trivialised by our Australian representatives and our senior officials. Fellow Australians, our culture is fast being destroyed. Values we hold dear are being ransomed by politicians in order to serve agendas that are perpetuated by the United Nations and secret think tanks like Chatham House in London. gender fluidity, the abolition of Father's Day for Special Persons Day, the abolition of Christmas Day as too politically incorrect for other minority groups, and the sexualisation of our children in the Safe Schools program by far-left Marxist groups harboured in Victoria. Marxism is socialism. The same socialism which we fought in World War II against Adolf Hitler. Socialism is communism, which was the so-called threat in Vietnam, and the reasons Australian soldiers went to war in Vietnam, to fight a communism that is now running amok in our own halls of Parliament. Let us not delve too deeply into the fact that most of our members of Parliament are now under investigation and scrutiny of the Constitution of whether they are even sanctioned to sit in Parliament due to their potential dual citizenship. However, the crux of this issue is yet far more sinister and nefarious. Mayor Amschel Rothschild, founder of the Rothschild banking dynasty, once said, "Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who writes its laws." The same Rothschild dynasty that Queen Elizabeth and her family have a close friendship and association with actually financed both Germany and Britain in World War II, with impunity. Whilst one family thrived off the war, our diggers were slaughtered for their profits. These days, such crimes by Australian laws are considered the financing of terrorism and subject to harsh and lengthy penalties. But the Rothschilds today remain safe, largely out of the public spotlight, whilst they trade trillions of dollars of their own and the CIA's black money. In relation to the Nugan Bank and the illegal drug financing in Australia, to this date, all our federal enforcement and intelligence agencies remain mute, from the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, Asio, the Australian Federal Police, ASIS, the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, which is our foreign arm of intelligence, and Aegis, the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, which is basically the authority that manages our entire Australian intelligence community. Not to mention our local federal MP, Lou O'Brien, who has been formally and for the record served a legal caution on this issue. Foreign Minister Julie Bishop and Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, all of which have acknowledged the evidence and the crimes recognised in full seriousness. They have colluded with the crime by standing back, remaining silent, and continuing to allow it to happen. In Australian speak, it's basically the same as standing back and allowing your friend to rape a girl at a party and then not reporting it, but sharing the story amongst your friends. Whilst that person did not commit the rape, they are party and thus are guilty to the crime by association and are damned by their very silence. In that case, our entire government can be proven to be party and collaborators to terrorist-related activity, such as large-scale drug trafficking, bank fraud, murder, and genocide. And so I will not remember this Remembrance Day in the hypnotic, ritualistic, business-as-usual trance that the mainstream media and body politic would feed us. I will not. I will remember the diggers and my grandfather that toiled, and by my actions to fight for justice and accountability on this issue in a country those fallen would be proud of today. The imprisonment of my grandfather, his grit, survival and tenacity, as a result ensured that I was even born years later. I refuse to perpetuate a permanent war economy that only benefits bankers and private contractors that feed off the countless deaths and suffering of our families, not theirs. The very same families that members of our broken government continue to maintain alliances with, while spending hard-working Australian taxpayers' money. Soldiers of Australia, both current and retired, I truly salute you, your courage and your bravery. It saddens me to announce that we have all been used by this global agenda to control and ensure the domination of the US petrodollar, oil, gold and drug supplies of an elite few. And I will not be party to these crimes. Proof of all my allegations is linked via Dropbox on the link to this broadcast. To date, our nation's leaders have played a game of pass the parcel with this most important intelligence. Member for Wide Bay, Lou O'Brien, Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, Deputy Secretary of National Security, Alan McKinnon, Inspector General, Margaret Stone, and Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. On this noble occasion of the mourning of our departed brave ones, you have sullied and tarnished what is most sacrosanct and powerful about our nation. You have bled us of our independence and our identity as Australians, and sold us out to the highest bidder. Because of your crimes, our nation has become an experiment house of fools, run by village idiots that pay no creed to the values of our country. This is something, as an Australian man, the grandson of a fighter, and as a father myself, that I cannot and will not permit. Because I know if those many who have fought and died were alive today, they would be aghast at what our nation has become. A tragedy of unconscionable proportions. You, so-called leaders and civil servants, have defaulted on your obligations and responsibilities under the Constitution and your statutes to govern, regardless of your consensual statutes and secret covenants to a powerful few. The people now, myself included, will not be silenced, as Kennedy was, and as the many who have tried and failed to rally a call for the sanity of days past. I move now to engage the defunct federal government in a High Court proceedings. I welcome the support of the Australian people who wish to remember a country that their own parents, grandparents and great-grandparents fought and died for. My office's intelligence is protected by a dead man's trigger. I will not be influenced or intimidated by your fear-mongering. I dream of golden soils, of nature's gifts, of Indigenous legends that are the very heartbeat and soul of this great country, Australia. And with the resolution of all the issues I put forward today, a bright future for our children. Thank you.
My wife and I were in London on the night before the Trooping of the Colour, and we had friends for dinner, and we went to the restaurant and met them for dinner. In the course of dinner, with our guest, who is the chairman of a very prominent and highly successful and reputable British FSA-controlled financial institution, he asked me if I could help him in getting identification of the validity of people who had brought to him a huge transaction for a corporate reconstruction. And could I help him by validating people? Because he knew that I had connections from the past where I could get onto various intelligence agencies and establish the validity of people. That's how it started.
And what is it that they're offering?
they're representing themselves as a massive supranational accumulation of funds which are not sovereign national foreign funds, but are the proceeds of a massive amount of commercial activity which have accumulated over probably most of 100 years. And they are concerned that they have all this wealth in a world which is beginning to lose its track on its own economic progress and stability, and they want to put their assets to work to help save the world.
So they think that by helping plug the UK debt, they'll boost their own wealth?
They're quite directly saying, no, they're not. They're saying that they will protect the wealth of the world so that they will continue to survive with their wealth in it. But they are saying quite particularly that they want the United Kingdom to take a leading initiative in this because they see us as being the logical point from which they can deploy a lot of their support into the European sector, which they think is in dire need of help and support at this time.
And you believe that this is a genuine offer and not a hoax?
I've been working on this now with them for 21 weeks. They have not put a foot wrong. In 21 weeks they have never contradicted themselves or said anything which would give a lie to anything that they have said. And therefore, from that point of view, I am progressively comfortable with the genuineness of their approach. They have gone out of their way to ask me to introduce them to government officials within the coalition with whom they can talk to open this up. And there has been a natural high level of scepticism, because it's rather like finding after all these years, the good gracious, you find on Christmas Eve that Father Christmas really does exist and he's just popped down your chimney, and it is a bit of a surprise. So the government officials have voiced a lot of scepticism, and the people I'm dealing with from X have been forthcoming with a list of referees who they've quoted, who are amongst the most powerful and the most high-profile people on the whole world stage, and they've invited the British government to pick up a phone to these people to validate their existence. Provided that the British government do so at the highest level of security, they will then talk to people at the highest level of security on the world stage who will validate them. This has so far, I understand, not happened at that level, because the government in this country decided that I must be a maverick old peer who'd lost his marbles and that they couldn't really trust this at all, and therefore they should look to see more rationally if it was feasible. And they came up with two major objections to the proposal which was being put forward, and said this means it couldn't be true. And I've looked very carefully at those two objections, and I think that the government has misunderstood completely and has come up to the wrong conclusions, and I've said that in my speech on Monday night.
And what made you speak on Monday publicly?
I have so far not succeeded in getting it proven because the British government officials have not yet taken it up. This was a debate about the impact of the strategic spending review and what it was going to have as an impact on society, and down to levels of deprivation and concern which were being voiced very strongly by the socialist opposition on the benches opposite. And I therefore spoke about it on Monday because it seemed to me that the opposition benches were overreacting, and that probably nothing was going to be quite as bad as they were saying it would be, but it could be a great deal better if we could really get GDP back into growth, which clearly what is being offered by X will have a massive impact on our GDP, in which case we could probably generate a far faster recovery to overcome a lot of the deprivation problems long before they occurred, according to the script that the socialist opposition were pushing to us.
And if this did go ahead, what would it look like? What would it mean for Britain?
It would mean a massive improvement in the job market, because so much of what they're doing is aimed at creating infrastructure which is headcount intensive. For example, the things that they're proposing at the present moment, since Monday they have said to me that if the government will now give an answer to them now as to whether they will support this, and by now I think they mean in the course of the next week, then X will put up and have in our bank by Christmas Day the entire £17 billion we need to build Crossrail now and bring it forward from the 10-year distant date it is. And think how many jobs that will create and the impact that will have on the vitality of London and everything else that will go with it. That creates GDP, which is wealth, and that brings money into the equation. But they're also quite specifically saying, look, you can't afford to hang back on your renewable energy policy. So if you have a preferred policy at this moment to do the underground gasification of coal and the conversion of your power stations to use underground gasification of coal, we will pay for that as well. But your spending review has also taken out all the hospitals and the schools that you needed to build, and we'll build those for you as well.
And would this money come with strings attached?
It comes interest-free, and it comes with no requirement to guarantee the value when it is paid back, and it comes with no repayment schedule, so it can be with us for as long as we need it. I'm going to have to make a very big apology to my noble friend, the noble Lord Sassoon, because I'm about to raise a subject which I shouldn't raise, which is going to be one which I think is now time to put on a higher awareness and to explain to the House as a whole, as I don't think they have any knowledge of. I'm sorry the noble Lord Strathclyde is not with us at the moment, because this deeply concerns him also. But for the last 20 weeks, since yesterday afternoon, I have been engaged in a very strange dialogue with the two noble lords, in the course of which I've been trying to bring to their attention the willing availability of a strange organisation which wishes to make a great deal of money available to assist the recovery of the economy in this country. For want of a better description of their name, I'll call them Foundation X. It's not their real name, but it'll do for the moment. Foundation X was introduced to me 20 weeks ago last week by a very eminent city firm, FSA controlled, by its chairman, who came to me, and its chairman said, we have this extraordinary request to assist in doing this major financial reconstruction, it's mega bucks, but we need your help to assist us in understanding whether this business is legitimate. I had the biggest put down of my life from the noble Lord Strathclyde when I told him this story first of all. He said, why you? You're not important enough to have the answer to a question like that. And he's quite right. My noble lord, I'm not important enough, but the answer to the next question was, you haven't got the experience for it. Yes, I do. I have had one of the biggest experiences in the laundry of terrorist money and of funny money that anybody's had in the city. I've handled billions of terrorist money. Not into my pocket. The biggest terrorist client I had was the IRA, and I'm pleased to say that I managed to write off more than £1 billion of their money. I've also had extensive connections with North African terrorists, but that's of a far nastier nature, and I don't want to talk about that because that's still a security issue. I would also hasten to add, it's no use getting the police in for me, because I shall immediately call the Bank of England as my defence witness, as they put me in to deal with these problems. So the point is that I was, in the course of doing this very strange activity, I got a very interesting set of phone numbers and references which I could go to for help when I needed it. And so people in the city have known that if they want to check out anything that looks at all odd, they can come to me and I can press a few phone numbers and get a reference. And so they came to me and asked me whether I would get them a reference and a clearance on Foundation X. And for 20 weeks I've been endeavouring to do so. I myself have come to the absolute conclusion that they are completely genuine and sincere, and that they are quite directly wishing to make the United Kingdom one of the principal points for which they will use to disseminate their extraordinary great wealth into the world at this present moment as part of an attempt to seek the economic recovery of the global economy. And so I made the phone call to my noble friend Lord Strathclyde on a Sunday afternoon. I think he was sitting on his lawn, poor man. And he did the quickest ball pass I've ever seen. If England can do anything like it at Twickenham on Saturday, we have a chance against the All Blacks. And the next thing I knew, I'd got the noble Lord Sassoon on the phone instead. And he, from the outset, took the quite right, proper defensive attitude of total scepticism and said, this possibly can't be right. In the course of the following weeks, I had, first of all, the noble Lord Sassoon said, go and talk to the Bank of England. So I phoned the governor of the Bank of England and said, could he please check this out for me? And he came back after about 3 days and said, you can get lost. I'm not touching this with a barge pole. It's far too difficult. Take it back to the Treasury. So I did. And within another day, the noble Lord Sassoon had come back and said, this is rubbish. It can't possibly be right. So I said, well, I'm going to work more on it. And then I had a meeting with the noble Lord Strathclyde, and I actually bought one of the senior executives of Foundation X to meet Lord Strathclyde. I have to say that as first dates go, it was not a great success. neither of them ended up by inviting the other one up for a coffee or a drink at the end of the evening, and they didn't exchange telephone numbers in order to be able to follow up the call. In fact, I found myself between a rock and a hard place, represented by both a rock and a hard place, which were totally paranoid about each other, because the Foundation X people have got an amazing obsession with their own security. They are expecting only to be contacted by somebody equal to head of state status, or somebody who has an international security rating equal to the top 6 people in the world. And this is such a strange situation. So both the noble Lord Sassoon and the noble Lord Strathclyde both came up with what should have been an absolute killer argument as to why this could not be true and we should forget it. Noble Lord Sassoon's argument first was that these people were offering evidence, or they claimed evidence, that they had lodged £5 billion with British banks last year. And they gave dates, and they gave transfer dates and the details of these transfers. And as Noble Lord Sassoon said, if that was true, it would stick out like a sore thumb. You couldn't have £5 billion popping out of a bank account without it disrupting the balance sheet completely. But I remember that about the same time that those transfers were being made, the Noble Lord Miners was indulging in his game of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic of the British banking community. And if he had 3 banks at that time, which had had, say, a deficiency of £1.5 billion each, then you'd pretty well have absorbed the entire £5 billion, and you wouldn't have the sore sum stick out on this at that time, because you'd have put £1.5 billion into each of 3 banks, and you'd have lost the lot, or absorbed the lot. That would be a logical explanation. I don't know. Noble Lord Strathclyde came up with a much different argument. He said, this cannot be right. This cannot be right, because these people said at the meeting with him that they were still effectively on the gold standard from back in the 1920s, and that their entire currency holdings throughout the world, which were very large, were backed by bullion. And the Noble Lord Strathclyde came back and said to me, he'd had his analysts working on it, and this has to be stuff and nonsense, because he said they had come up with a figure for the amount of bullion that would have been needed to cover their currency reserves as claimed, which would be more than the entire value of bullion that had ever been mined in the history of the world. I'm sorry, but the Noble Lord Strathclyde is wrong. His analysts are wrong, because what he had done was he had tapped into the sources which are available, and there is only one definitive source for the amount of bullion that has ever been taken from the Earth's crust, and that was a National Geographic magazine article 12 years ago. And whatever figure it was that they quoted was then quoted again by 6 other sites on the internet, on Google, and so everybody's quoting one original source, and there is no other confirming authority. But if you tack into the Vatican accounts of the Vatican Bank, you come up with a claim of total bullion.
The Noble Lord is into his 15th minute. I wonder if he could draw his remarks to conclusion.
The total value of the Vatican Bank reserves would claim to be more than the entire value of gold ever mined in the history of the world. Now, my point on all of this is that we have not proven any of this. Foundation X are saying at this present moment that they are prepared to put up the entire £5 billion for the funding and creation of the 3i recreation. The British government can have the entire independent management and control of it. They don't want anything to do with it. There will be no interest charged. And by the way, if the British government would like it as well, if it will help, they will be prepared to put up money for funding hospitals, schools, the building of Crossrail immediately with 17 billion transfer by Christmas if requested, and all these other things. These things can be done if wished, but we have to have a senior member of the government has to accept the invitation to a phone call to the chairman of the company concerned, Foundation X, and then we can get into business. And all I'm asking is that this is too big an issue. I'm just an aging, obsessive old peer, and I'm easily dispensable, but getting to the truth is not. And we need to know what really is happening here. My Lords, we must find out the truth of this situation. My Lords, I'm going to start, I don't wish you to get too encouraged by that. I'm going to start with my conclusions, but I'm not going to sit down when I've made them, because I'm going then to give you the evidence to support them, and hopefully present to you the reasons why I want support for an official inquiry into the mischief I want to unfold to yourselves this afternoon. My Lords, I've been engaged in this pursuit of this issue for nearly 2 years now, and I'm no further through to getting to the truth. I think there are 3 possible conclusions which may come from it. I think there may have been a massive piece of money laundering committed by a major government which ought to know better, and that it has effectively undermined the integrity of a British bank, the Royal Bank of Scotland, in doing so. The second alternative is that a major American department has an agency which has gone rogue on it because it has been wound up and has created a structure out of which they are seeking to get, well, at least 50 billion euros as a payoff. And the third possibility is that this is an extraordinary elaborate fraud which has not been carried out, but which has been prepared in order to provide a threat to one government or more if they don't pay them off. So there are 3 possibilities, and this all needs a very urgent review. My Lords, it starts in April and May of 2009 with the alleged transfer to the United Kingdom, to the HSBC, of a sum of $50 trillion. And 7 days later, ping, in comes another $50 trillion to the HSBC, and then 3 weeks later, another $50 trillion. Total of $5 trillion in each case, sorry. Total of $15 trillion is alleged to have been passed into the hands of HSBC for onward transit to the Royal Bank of Scotland, and we need to look to where this came from and what the history of this money is, and I have been trying to sort out the sequence by which this money has been created and where it's come from for a long time. It starts off apparently as the property of a man called Johannes Riardi, who has some claims to be considered the richest man in the world. Well, he would be if all the money that was owed to him was paid, but I have seen accounts of his showing he owns $36 trillion in a bank, and it is a ridiculous sum of money. On the other hand, the $36 trillion would be consistent with the dynasty from which he comes and the fact that they had been effectively the emperors of Indochina in times gone by. But a lot of that money has been taken away from him with his consent by the American Treasury over the years for the specific purpose of helping to support the dollar. And he has sent to me a really quite remarkable document which is dated in February 2006, in which the American government have called him to a meeting with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is neither Federal Reserve nor a bank. It's a bit like Celebrity Big Brother. It's got 3 names to describe it, and none of them are true. And this document, which is quite astonishing, purports to have been a meeting which is witnessed by Mr. Alan Greenspan, who signed for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, of which he was chairman, as well as the real Federal Reserve Bank in Washington. And it is signed by Mr. Timothy Geithner, who as a witness on behalf of the International Monetary Fund, who sent 2 witnesses, the other one being Mr. Yusuke Horiguchi. And these gentlemen have signed as witnesses to the effect that this deal is a proper deal. There are a lot of other signatures on here. This is not a photocopy, this is an original version of the contract, under which the American Treasury have apparently got the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to offer to buy out the bonds which have been issued to Mr. Riardi to replace the cash which has been taken from him over the previous 10 years. And they're giving him $500 million as a cash payment to buy out worthless bonds. Now, this is all in the agreement, and it's very remarkable. I would have thought establishing whether this is a correct piece of paper or not is just 2 phone calls away, one to Mr. Geithner and one to Mr. Greenspan, both of whom still prosper and live, so they could easily confirm whether they signed this. Mr. Rayardi has, by passing these bonds over, also put at the disposal of the US Treasury the entire asset backing which he was alleged to have for the 15 trillion. I now have a letter here from the Bank of Indonesia which says that the whole thing was a pack of lies, that he did not have the 750,000 tons of gold which was supposed to be backing it. He only had 700 tons. And this is really a piece of complete fabrication. Finally, I have a letter here from Mr. Rayardi himself, who tells me that he was put up to do this and none of it was true, and that he has been robbed of all his money. And I'm quite prepared to recognise that one of the possibilities here is that Mr. Rayardi is himself putting this together as a forgery in order to go and try and win some recovery back. But it gets more complicated than that, because each of the 5 trillion payments that came in has been acknowledged and receipted by the senior executives of HSBC, and again receipted by the executives of the Royal Bank of Scotland. And I have a set of the whole of those receipts for all of this money. Why would any bank want to sign £5 trillion worth, $5 trillion worth, 15 trillion in total, of receipts if the money didn't exist? The money was said to have come, first of all, from the Rayardi account to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York it was passed to JP Morgan Chase in New York for onward transit to London. The means of sending it was a SWIFT note, which ought to have been registered with the Bank of England if it was genuine. So when this happened and came about, I first of all took it to my noble friend Lord Strathclyde and said, what do we do with this? He said, give it to Lord Sassoon, he's the Treasury. So we did, and Lord Sassoon looked at it and said immediately, this is rubbish, it's far too much money, it would stick out like a sore thumb and you can't see it in the Royal Bank of Scotland accounts. Quite right. Secondly, he said, the gold backing it is ridiculous. There's only been 1,507 tons of gold mined in the history of the world, so you can't have 750,000 tons. This is true. And the third thing he said obviously was, it's a scam. And I agree with him, it was a scam. The problem is we stopped looking at that point. We should have asked, what is the scam, instead of at that time just nodding it off. And we have never really resolved this, because today I have this quite frightening piece of paper, which is my justification for bringing it into this meeting today, which is available on the internet, and I'm astonished that it hasn't already been unearthed by the Treasury, and every alarm bell in the land should be ringing if it has, because this is the General Audit Office of the Federal Reserve, the real Federal Reserve in Washington, and its audit review in end of July 2010 on the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It has on it some 20 banks listed, to which $16.115 trillion are outstanding in loans. My lords, that is the sore thumb that was being looked for by Lord Sassoon. But more particularly, there are two other very interesting things with this. The first is that Barclays Bank have got 868 billion of loan. The Royal Bank of Scotland has got 541 billion, in which case one has to ask, as they could have earned in 3 weeks enough to pay off their entire indebtedness to the taxpayers in Britain, why they have not done so, and could we please ask them to put a cheque in the post tonight for the whole 46 billion. And the third thing that's wrong with it is that every bank on this list, without exception, is an MTN registered bank, which means that they are registered to use medium-term notes to move funds between themselves with an agreed profit share formula. In which case these banks are investing this money, and most extraordinary, not a penny of interest does the Federal Bank of New York want paid on this vast amount of 16 trillion. Anyone amongst yourselves who knows what the IMF rules are will immediately smell a rat. Because the IMF has very strict rules for validating dodgy money. There are two ways of doing it. You either pass it through a major central bank like the Bank of England, who had apparently refused to touch this, or alternatively, you put it through to a bank which is an MTN trading bank, which is then able to use the funds on the overnight European MTN trading market, where they can earn between 1 and 2.5% profit per night, and the compound interest on that is huge. So there is a vast profit being made with this money somewhere if it is in fact genuine. So, my lords, I believe that this is such an important issue now that I've put everything I've got on the subject into a 104 megabyte memory thumb, and I want the government to put this to some suitable investigative bureau and take everything I've got on the subject and find out what the truth is of what is going on here, because there is something very seriously wrong. Either we have a huge amount of tax uncollected on profits made, or we have a vast amount of money festering away in the European banking system which is not real money, in which case we need to take it back. My lords, I ask for an investigation, and please support my plea.